I'm Digvir Jais, Vice President Research and International at the University of Manitoba. Welcome. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba is on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. These cafes have been an initiative of my office since 2008. In that time, we have held more than 65 of these discussions, all in person. 2020 and the global pandemic has changed the format, but I hope not the engagement, and I encourage you to engage fully with the panel. I'm happy and excited to be able to continue these events in a new format that reaches a wider audience and from the comfort of your home to learn firsthand about what our research experts are doing to find solutions to global problems. Tonight's panel of experts and moderator will share their expertise on the current state-of-the-art thinking on how to power our planet in a sustainable way. I encourage you to participate in the conversation with our experts. I will hand things off to your moderator for this evening, Dr. David Herbert, an Associate Professor of Chemistry and the Faculty of Science Research Chair in Fundamental Sciences at the University of Manitoba. He will tell you more about the panelists and how things will work in this format. Miigwech, thank you, merci. David?
Thank you, Dr. Jais, and good evening, and thank you all for joining us. On March 11th of this year, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 health crisis to be a global pandemic, spurring governments around the world, including our own, to take drastic measures in an effort to slow the spread of the novel coronavirus responsible for the often tragic consequences of COVID-19. Starting with the isolation of individuals, public health measures quickly expanded to include school closures, suspension of workplace activities, and even mandatory home confinement in some places. Public transportation in major cities emptied, roads cleared, and factories were paused at an unquestionably huge economic and social cost. While the human health toll of COVID-19 and the societal costs of public health efforts cannot be understated or forgotten, stories began emerging about cleaner air and quieter streets that have accompanied this unprecedented lockdown of global commerce and travel. A recent study published online in the peer-reviewed journal Nature Climate Change has put some numbers to these tales. Compared with mean 2019 levels, daily global carbon dioxide emissions had decreased by 17% by early April 2020, with just under half of this decline attributable to changes in surface transport. But as a recent article in the Economist newspaper stated, quote, "The COVID-19 pause is not inherently climate friendly. Countries must make it so," end quote. And it's true. These changes are unquestionably temporary. With economies around the world restarting at various speeds, it is safe to say that most reductions that we have seen in emission levels do not reflect structural changes in economic, transportation, or energy systems. Efforts to boost economic activity, for example, may yet induce an even higher trajectory for emissions should governments ease back on climate-related restrictions as part of stimulus efforts. Social distancing is likely to impact future growth in the use of public transportation. And yet, citizens in cities including New York, Paris, and even Winnipeg have experienced the benefits of more street space dedicated to active transportation. Air quality in metropolises from Los Angeles to New Delhi is the best it's been in decades. And many of the world's governments are working together and promising global action, including Canada's, which has devoted $600 million in funding for global vaccine efforts, in addition to the $850 million pledged in support of specific global efforts to discover a coronavirus vaccine. As International Development Minister, the Honorable Karina Gold told the CBC on May 12th, "Our health here in Canada depends on the health of everyone everywhere." The same thing, it would seem, could be said about our climate. So what about our climate? Carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels are the main cause of human-induced climate change. The Paris Agreement, signed in 2016 as part of the annual Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, set a specific global target to stabilize and drastically reduce global carbon dioxide emissions in order to limit changes in global temperature to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. To achieve this goal, climate models published by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, show that global emissions need to peak before 2030 and rapidly decline thereafter to at least 25% lower than they were in 2018. Prior to the COVID pandemic, however, carbon dioxide emissions rose by about 1% per year over the past decade, though they stabilized by some accounts in 2019. For our part, Canada has experienced a period of decline in total emissions over the decade from 2007 to 2017, but CO2 emissions have begun to creep higher again. Our per capita emissions, however, have stabilized with a slight drop from 2007 numbers. While the reasons for emissions decline can be varied and complex, a number of studies highlight a key role of the rapidly plummeting cost of renewable energy. But cost alone won't do it. Accelerating deployment of renewable energy is likely to translate into meaningful emissions reductions only if it is accompanied by extensive measures to phase out the use of fossil fuels. So how might we make this happen? When we originally proposed this Café Scientifique on sustainable energy, we thought about this question in terms of the ongoing national debate over pipelines, carbon pricing, and public investment in energy production. In this special online edition, we instead propose to take your questions and discuss the merits of sustainable energy development and use in Canada in light of the present pandemic, including the social, economic, and environmental cases for renewable energy as a global priority, what a transition to a carbon-neutral energy economy might actually look like, and the current state-of-the-art thinking on how to power our planet in a sustainable way. To help us with this discussion, we welcome tonight 3 panelists. Dr. Shirley Thompson is an associate professor in the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Manitoba. Her work involves community-driven research into a wide variety of issues, including community-led education, ecosystem health, and the built environment, as well as sustainable energy. Dr. Derek Oliver is the director of the Manitoba Institute for Materials, as well as professor and associate head of the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department in the Price Faculty of Engineering at the University of Manitoba. His own research involves solar energy harvesting materials and water splitting. And as director of the Manitoba Institute for Materials, he heads a facility dedicated to material science at the University of Manitoba. And Dr. Michael McDonald is a sustainable transportation specialist at Motor Coach Industries. A graduate of the PhD program in the chemistry department at the U of M, Dr. McDonald also held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working in an international solar energy research consortium funded by the US National Science Foundation. My name is David Herbert, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry and your moderator for this evening. And we welcome all of you. Our format for this event will include brief remarks from our panel, followed by discussions stimulated by questions from you, our online audience. For our audience, this is a discussion forum, and as such, we're happy to answer your questions, provided that they are of a general nature. This being our first online Café Scientifique, we also ask for your patience should we experience any technical difficulties. Dr. Oliver, perhaps we can start with you. Could you outline the breadth of cutting-edge research into sustainable energy that you see ongoing in academic labs around the world?
Thanks, David. Sustainable energy research takes in a really large range of big collaborations as well as individual research groups all over the world. Examples of breathtakingly big international collaborations include the quest for nuclear fusion, for example, the ITER site near Cadarache in southern France. But when we consider sustainable energy, we think of renewable sources of energy. The light that we receive from the sun, the wind that blows across the land and sea, as well as the movement of water, whether it's along rivers or the ebb and flow of tides. Our experience is familiar with all of these, including their variation from day to day and season to season. Intimately connected with the conversation of how we harness energy and convert it from rays of sunlight or the mechanical motion introduced by wind and water is what form of energy we convert it to, how and where we use that energy, and how we store the energy. We are heavily dependent on fossil fuels because they have a high density of energy. That means how far we can drive a vehicle on a tank of fuel, or how long we can run the furnace in our home for a certain amount of fuel. We can store these fuels and transport them easily. That's a provocative statement given the environmental and land ownership conversations that surround pipelines. But the point that I want to make with that is technology, the engineering implementation of how to store and move these fuels, is mature. That's the maturity that helps keep costs down. So what are renewable sources of energy? Here in Manitoba, we generate most of our energy from hydroelectricity. These installations produce electricity which must be transmitted to where it's used. Again, the engineering of this is mature. We are fortunate to have a robust energy supply to most of the province, and because of the generation capacity, the cost is relatively low. But the environmental impact of building large hydroelectric installations is enormous. We might argue that environmental impact and land use issues that these developments raise are balanced by the needs of wider society. Again, it's not a closed discussion, but an ongoing conversation that we ground in mature technology. Wind generation technology has expanded greatly in recent decades. Many installations involve turbines with diameters in the range of 40 to 90 meters. That's between 100 and 300 feet. The largest installed designs have rotor diameters twice that size at 164 meters, and there are current plans to include turbines with a diameter over 250 meters. In height, that structure will be comparable to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Wind generation still has an environmental footprint. Just like dams, the source of generation is not necessarily where the energy is used, particularly if you site the wind farms offshore or in remote locations. With appropriate storage, wind generation can be set up as the basis for local, independent generation for remote communities. For widespread use, wind generation brings added complexity to the network that supplies the power. The multiple generation sites have to be synchronized, and their fluctuating contributions require continual management to ensure network stability. Developments in computing power and resources have been crucial to the expansion of wind generation. As a result, it's the fastest growing contributor to power generation in Europe, responsible for replacing many coal-based facilities. I want to briefly mention tidal generation. Places with large difference between high and low tide levels include the Bay of Fundy on the Atlantic coast, the Severn Estuary in the UK, and similar parts of coastal Denmark, the Netherlands, and France. Maintaining these devices in the ocean is an incredible engineering challenge. Despite decades of study, this technology has yet to mature to a point where it's close to commercial viability. This brings me to the topic of capturing solar energy. The total amount of energy consumed on Earth in a year is comparable to the energy from sunlight that strikes the Earth in a matter of a few hours. We have a range of materials that can absorb sunlight and convert it into electricity. Now, we have to consider cloudy days, long and dark winter days near the poles, and the inconvenience of half the globe being in shade at any given time. I mentioned earlier the importance of computing power to stabilize complex power generation and transmission networks, but that's not enough. We need some form of storage, and the discussion of harvesting solar energy goes hand in hand with research in how to store energy. Battery technology is the hot conversation topic and focus of many research labs. Our go-to technologies rely heavily on elements such as lithium and cobalt. These resources are located in places which, for geopolitical reasons, mean that security of supply as well as abundance have to be considered. But storing charge in batteries isn't as optimal as we'd like. In simple terms, large batteries leak charge and need to be continually topped up. By comparison, current technologies for storing hydrogen are mature enough and can achieve the required scale of storage without the leaks that we experience with batteries and charge. So can we generate hydrogen sustainably? If we use sunlight as our energy source to separate water into oxygen and hydrogen, then the answer is yes. The basic chemistry has been documented for nearly 250 years. Making efficient devices that absorb the sunlight and convert water, and making devices that can last for years are the research challenges that have engaged myself and others in laboratories worldwide, from Europe to Asia to this continent. We've collaborated with a network of scientists in the US, particularly at Caltech, in pursuit of this goal. Our expertise has been to make silicon rods that absorb the sunlight and provide the interface at which the water is split, evolving the gases. But there are other approaches. The state government in Western Australia is participating in a commercial pilot plant that collects electricity generated from an array of ordinary solar cells to electrolyze water and produce hydrogen. Part of their strategy is to attempt to repurpose the existing natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen. To summarize, we've got a really interesting mixture of mature and emergent technologies. What's exciting is the prospect that some of these technologies can be scaled, from small and remote communities to much larger networks. But I think that the challenge is as much how we store energy as it is how we extract it from a renewable resource, such as sunlight, water, or wind. Thanks. Back to you, Dave.
Thanks, Derek. So, Dr. McDonald, you've had the benefit of working in academic labs at MIT and in Winnipeg, where researchers are busy discovering the future of renewable energy. In addition, through your current role as Sustainable Transportation Specialist at Motor Coach Industries, you're able to see the implementation of sustainable energy or sustainable transportation in the here and now. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about what is going on in modern industry in adopting sustainable methods?
Yeah, for sure, Dave. Just, I guess, a bit of a background. So I work for MCI, which is Motor Coach Industries, and we're a sister company of the NFI group, which includes New Flyer Industries. So basically, I work in the motor coach business, sort of like the Greyhound long run bus business, while New Flyer is more in the transit agency, and we're sister companies. And New Flyer, again, the transit business, has been trying to build an electric transit bus since around 2010. And so you've probably seen this in the news, the proliferation of the Winnipeg built electric bus built by New Flyer. 2010, when they started designing this, was, believe it or not, 10 years ago now. I know it seems hard to believe, and that's because that in addition to some of the difficulties in doing a new design and engineer, and basically a reimagining of how an electric or how a regular bus works. In addition to that, you also have prototyping, you have demoing, and you have to get adoption online. So, and those are all separate things that take a great deal of time. For example, New Flyer's only received bulk orders from last year, and that's because they spent the greater part of the past decade, in addition to refining their product, trying to convince various agencies that this is the way to go and to try it out, and it's taken them some time to adopt that. And even at MCI, where we're a sister company of them, trying to take that technology that they've developed for a bus and then translate that to a motor coach, that still comes with a great deal of challenges. So basically, there's just a really long life cycle of taking any sort of technology, new or old, and adopting it to a specific application. Some exciting news that I have from my industry, for example, and I'm not even really sure if I'm supposed to say this publicly or not, but we were awarded our first electric coach order 2 weeks ago from a transit agency in Los Angeles that operates a commuter style bus to and from the downtown LA area. So the California market is super, super hot. And this has just been primarily driven by regulation. So basically the state says, we're going to, offer you this amount of money and you need to reduce your emissions. And they basically say, okay, well, we're not going to say no to that kind of money. Let's give it a try. So we have a certain amount of demos that are in the field. And what we found from our potential customers is that in addition to the sustainability factor and in addition to the environmental factor, they love everything else about the bus, such as its quietness and its smooth driving. So those have ended up actually becoming the defining features. And so that's a public sector example. If you look to the private sector, there's some corporations in the area. So just move up the state to the Bay Area, where you have the Apples and the Googles and the Facebooks, all those big tech companies that need to move massive amounts of employees to and from work to home. They don't necessarily have to abide by the same regulations, at least at this point, but they're doing it. They're still interested. And believe it or not, it's not just about the environment. Like certainly there's a a good amount from that area of corporate responsibility and taking ownership of their environmental and carbon footprint. But what's interesting is when a private company comes to us and says, you know what, we're interested in electric coaches and electric buses, and we ask, so why, if you're not complying, or if you're not seeking compliance or anything like that, like, you know, they're far more expensive, at least at this point. And they'll say, well, you know, it doesn't matter because this is just the future. So there's this sort of sense of inevitability in the industry, which, you know, for which the environmental impact is just this really great byproduct that comes of it. So it's really great that I think that both from a private sector that's under the influence of government regulations and the private sector that's not so much, that both of them are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, that sustainable transportation is the way to go. In terms of the, I guess, the breadth of applications that coaches are going to cover. So again, we think of these, you know, massive tour buses as, you know, covering, you know, cross-country routes. At this point, that's not exactly the case. I mentioned a commuter type application. Those will be the early adopters of this technology. And then the long runs, or the longer runs, I should say, are basically going to follow and run parallel to the energy density of batteries and storage systems that are available and mature enough to adopt. So for the battery electric coach that we've developed, we're looking to the next generation to take us to that next step of complexity for the application. Another point that I'd like to touch on is one thing that's really cool about getting to work in my industry is that it's probably one of the most visible examples of commercialization of the latest technology. So sure, you know, you have personal phones and computers and such, but I think that electric mobility is still really new to a lot of people. Not everybody has an electric car. In fact, the vast majority of people don't. But maybe electric buses are going to be the most accessible, electrically driven technology that'll be accessible to everybody, and just by nature of it being, you know, public transit, then it'll be accessible to most. I think that some of the stuff that Derek was talking about in terms of really exciting lab scale technology, you know, all you have to do is go online and on the Google machine, and you'll see, you know, the latest and greatest of what's coming out of, you know, chemistry labs, engineering labs, physics labs, and such. And it's all just so exciting. But I think that there's a little bit of complacency that sometimes develops with the general public, just because I think that there's a disconnect between the amount of time that it takes to prove something scientifically in a lab and commercialize it. So sometimes these things get dismissed as hype, which kind of sucks because as scientists, we're so excited about new technology. But really, it's just a misunderstanding that this new technology needs to survive a lot of what we call TRLs, or technology readiness levels, in order to be implemented and widely available. So a good example of this is when I was at MIT doing my postdoc, I developed new materials that basically hold the guts of lithium-ion batteries together. And you know, this makes for an appealing article, whether that appears in a peer-reviewed journal or in you know, again on Google. No matter what, that's appealing. But Samsung isn't, you know, sending me a check for hundreds of millions of dollars for this technology. So there is a little bit of a hype factor there, and that's simply because the technology that I worked on never really survived those technology readiness levels and what it takes to get to commercialization. Whereas you can contrast that with the work that I do with MCI right now, you know, where we use the latest and greatest in batteries and motors that have been tuned specifically for mobility applications. And, you know, these things are great, or at least they are to me. But a regular person might look at that and say, oh, I guess, you know, it's batteries and a motor. It's not terribly exciting, but a deep dive, and you really only know this if you had my job, will show that these are basically the results of, you know, many incremental changes that have, you know, occurred over the past century and come to life. And that's because it takes a lot to survive the scientific scrutiny in order to be commercialized. So science, at least in the industry that I work in, is very exciting and very slow. And I think that my fellow scientists on the panel would be happy to echo that that's the case. And really, what we're seeing here is the course of many incremental changes. And you could think of them as these micro discoveries that are able to survive the scientific scrutiny. So I guess what you can think of, where when you think of the greater view of it, when I look at the technology that I get to work with, that it takes to power an electric bus or an electric coach, this is the stuff that survived that scientific scrutiny, and so that in itself is really exciting. And then one final point before I let you move on, Dave, is I think that one thing that's really interesting about electric mobility, electric buses and everything is suddenly what's old is new again. So things like electric motors and batteries and all their support electronics like inverters and converters and chargers, these things have been around forever. So a lot of this, comes down to batteries, and we can thank the revolution in personal devices for making energy density great again, for lack of a better term. And since range was always the issue, we needed to get the battery energy density and higher so we could fit more energy onto a vehicle, so we could make it go further and it could be applicable in the society that we've spent the last century building with our road systems. Another great example is fuel cells, which were initially planned to support the space race. So back in the 60s and 70s they're developed, and suddenly there was so much potential that was seen for them to create this complete hydrogen society. Well, here we are in 2020, we don't have one, but we're finally starting to see the viability in mobility applications. And so all this older technology that's been around for a while, it's great to see it having a chance to finally come online because the conditions are finally right. And then final point is another technology that's been around for a long time is just the power lines that are above our head. So we have all this infrastructure that's been around for the better part of the past century. It's aging, and in general, it's going to need to be more robust. If we think about the dependence that we have on residential electricity just to power our homes, like Derek, you needed to come into the office today because your Wi-Fi failed you. So we just have such a dependence on our residential electricity supply. So imagine if we suddenly shifted all of our mobile power supply to this exact same system. We need to reimagine it to some degree. And I think that some interesting spin-offs are the fact that as we also adopt more renewables to the grid, suddenly we see ourselves thinking about, the microgrid. So something that's less centralized in order to take advantage of renewables. Well, if, there's a tragic, natural disaster, for example, if you only have a couple of these microgrids going offline at once, then the entire system isn't affected. Same with storage. If we need to temper the energy demand between the increment supplies of power for solar and wind, and we need to basically temper that down, and we develop the technology to do that. It's nice to know that we'll have some energy available for us if we do have some sort of catastrophe. So these are some nice spin-offs of the technology that's also related to making a more sustainable future.
Great, thanks, Mike. So many great topics for further discussion. One of which leads us perfectly to our third panelist. So, Shirley, Dr. Thompson, Michael just mentioned that with respect to buses, it's not just about the environment for some of his clients. And your work in partnership with communities across Manitoba and Canada has touched upon the potential benefits of sustainable energy for remote communities. Could you maybe tell us a bit about societal benefits to renewable energy that we might sometimes overlook beyond those commonly discussed around global climate change? Shirley, I believe you're muted.
Sorry about that. Here, I'm talking today about some of the work we're doing in First Nations communities, looking at how particularly rural and remote communities are vulnerable to power lines going down. If you have to fly out to access power, you're at great risk, especially in a COVID-19 environment. So I am going to talk a little bit about how renewable energy is definitely for these communities part of their economic recovery plan and their sovereignty plan. But generally, the world is talking about how renewable energy plan is necessary for a green COVID-19 economic recovery plan, and to deal with climate change and for reconciliation. So in the Paris Agreement, Canada committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. But you're hearing now in the news how other European countries are having a race to zero. So you've heard that term, with Britain and other communities committing to these goals for greenhouse gas reductions. And hand in hand with that is how to create economic recovery after COVID. So this is seen as one of the key economic development scenarios, that green economic recovery requires a renewable energy plan. And with that, it includes large targets, energy targets of net zero. And net zero means you use as much as you produce. So it's looking at houses, businesses being net zero as a way of locally producing your own power without the large power line requirements. So some examples is Scotland had a 100% renewable energy target for electricity by 2020. And others, such as Denmark, 40%. So they're looking at it in all areas, including transportation, and those are lower targets, but there's targets. And it's very important to have targets to move towards things. So renewable energy targets are requirements that have to be met rather than just goals. So for example, Germany has set a target of 45% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So these commitments are long-term, and they become clear through these targets. As was mentioned, renewable energies are able to restore themselves over short periods of time without diminishing or causing extensive negative environmental and social impacts. They provide the alternative to the pipeline battles on Indigenous land in the territory of the Wet'suwet'en in British Columbia, which was never ceded. So this is a way we're now increasingly looking at how we can make peace, and realizing that colonization and racism has played a part in our development. And this is a piece of the puzzle. It's making us take a second look at the issues raised by large hydro in Manitoba for distributed power. Recently, this week, there was a knockout, as was mentioned, in Alberta with 80,000 out of power. And the ice storms only in 2019 put 34,000 people out of power in October of 2019 in the Interlake, and maybe some of the listeners today were part of that. There was a state of emergency declared, and Manitoba has not, and that has not been the only occasion in Canada. This creates great vulnerabilities for communities, and we see that with First Nations. Little Saskatchewan had to be out of their community for 3 weeks as the distribution lines were old and were crumpled, and it took time for them to be replaced. So when I'm working with First Nations communities, like with Sagamak, which is a fly-in community, I'm helping write with them climate and emergency plans, and they include shelters with renewable energies. So thinking that communities need heat and power, just like air and water. In Canada's winter, we are absolutely dependent on heat for survival. And so we need some assurances that in a storm, in an ice storm, that there will be heat and power. So in this fly-in community, which lacks roads, it has boats required from airports. It was important to include a solar and biomass renewable energy as part of their emergency shelter to provide food and heat for the community. As well, they've shifted their policy to include as well energy efficient wood stoves and other renewable energies in their housing. And we're teaching youth how to build. So part of a program, the Madison houses are being built with local wood to build energy efficient houses with local youth that consider not only energy efficiency, but also energy production. So renewable energy production. There are other communities in Manitoba that are leading the way too. Nelson Hauser-Nishiwan, NCN's strategic plan included considering alternative energy-based developments such as solar, wind power, geothermal, and hydrogen power projects. A key energy is leading the way in creating geothermal across Manitoba. In NCN, they have built fourplexes that have included solar power. Fisher River First Nation near NCN has created a solar farm consisting of 3,000 panels that can generate 1 million watts of power. And it's to supply 350 houses within their community. Now, a big concern as part of our framework on clean growth and climate change has been the reduction of reliance on diesel in Canada's remote communities. We have 4 communities that run on diesel, and they're particularly vulnerable as load restrictions limit supply. In Canada, we have 251 remote communities, and it just makes a good business case to provide renewable energies in these areas, looking at Lac Brochet and Brochet, using local materials, using biomass and wind and solar to give an energy mix. So this is providing community energy generation, which has the capability of offering decentralized power. So it's providing something called energy security and energy sovereignty. And it has greater efficiencies and contributes to local economies. So people are gathering wood, and in each step of the process, it's local people being paid to produce their own energy. I would say on a larger scale, there's great opportunity in this, as we are now looking at net zero building codes for 2030. And even ways for homes and businesses to give back power to the grid. So community power, by looking at a smaller scale through small hydro, biomass, solar, wind power, geothermal, provides opportunities for community development. And in the communities I work with in Island Lake, these are absolutely pristine communities who really have no fluctuating water. So their watershed is not fluctuating, is not impacted by hydro. And that's the last thing this community wants. So this provides an alternative as a way of producing cost competitively micro and small levels of 10 megawatts or less or more. Germany Renewable Energy in 2016, for example, showing that people can own their energy systems and can actually use this as an investment to fuel their pension, was 47% owned by citizens and co-ops, compared to 38% institutional and commercial ownership, and 15% energy suppliers. So I will leave with the message that community power can provide locally owned and provide local jobs and other economic opportunities, as well as energy security. So it's a way to look at energy sovereignty, energy security, and self-reliance, and increase the renewable energy quotient so that it's a larger percentage. It's unfeasible to create big energy mega dams for communities and populations, but it is very feasible to consider renewable energy and produce a net zero house at this point. There have been many, many cases of net zero houses, and as early as 1977, a house was built in Saskatchewan that was so airtight and well insulated, it could be warmed through a Saskatchewan winter with a hairdryer. But since then, there have been the Passive House Design Institute, lots of training, so that there's more than 13,000 passive houses throughout the world. And we're looking at scaling it up so that it's cities, communities, subdivisions that are a passive house now or net zero, rather than at only the house level or the business level. So there are great opportunities, and this should be seen as a green economic recovery and part of the COVID-19 plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. You know, it's always fascinating to me to hear the intersection of environmental concerns with those of economic concerns, of course, and then the idea of opportunities for redress for vulnerable communities. So thank you very much for shedding some light on that. We're going to try and take some questions from the audience. And these questions will be, you can input these questions via the link that's appearing on your screen right now. So it's at the website www.sly.do, where you enter the code 49263, and then you can enter a question if you have one for our panels, either addressed generally or if you'd like to hear someone's specific opinion on something. So please feel free to navigate there, and we'd be happy to take your questions. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, perhaps we can start off the conversation with something that appeared in a number of our panelists' opening remarks, and that is the idea of the idea that these are not necessarily new ideas. So when we talk about the existing technological solutions with respect to sustainable energy capture, conversion, and storage, we have a lot of options that could be tapped into. So, Dr. Oliver, maybe we could turn back to you. In your response to Dr. McDonald's statement about the long time scale that it often takes for something to be commercialized, do you have any or information for our audience or insights into technology that seemed to die on the vine that showed great promise that's now being re-emerging in some academic settings with respect to renewable energy?
I don't know that something's actually making a big comeback. You could maybe argue that thoughts of using hydrogen have come back a couple of times. Mike mentioned that they started off talking about fuel cells in the space race, and that died off pretty quickly because the only way people produce hydrogen normally was to take it as a fraction from fossil fuels, which is not exactly a solution to any sort of sustainable or renewable energy crisis. But the idea of extracting hydrogen from water, particularly if it's water or not a really clean water source, is something that's very attractive because it's actually utilizing a resource that's clearly renewable. The question comes whether it can actually make the jump, not just in terms of people showing a wide enough scale need for it. If you're going to have hydrogen used as part of the economy, then as Michael indicated, you need maybe lots of buses or somehow neighborhoods that are going to use this as the basis for machinery or something. It's not necessarily an easily scalable thing for a small community, although it could be, depending on just how it is used. There's a lot of capacity in the way this scales that would probably provide the opportunity for that transfer.
So the idea of a chemical fuel or hydrogen as a energy carrier is interesting because we constantly hear news about the great leaps forward in battery technology, in particular lithium-ion battery. So Dr. McDonald, you're involved in the procurement and the application of lithium-ion batteries. Do you know anything from, or does industry have any insight or comments on the ways that are being undertaken to minimize damage to the environment from lithium mining, or the impacts of lithium mining in the environment?
Sure. So it's definitely something that we're vigilant of, and that we hold our vendors responsible for and accountable for. And you know, just to be clear, you know, MCI, the company that I work for, doesn't, you know, make our own batteries, but we do procure them, and so we do take those sorts of things into account. And they definitely are questions that you know, we ask. So lithium is a hard question, because it's the backbone of the entire battery, as a you know, that is capable of the energy density that we need in order to make our application viable. Not to sidestep your question or anything, but I mean, if we look at other, you know, elements that are involved, such as, you know, cobalt, I would argue that that's, you know, an issue that deserves equal attention, since there's also ethical issues in addition to environmental, in terms of, you know, where it's mined. You know, we've probably all heard the horror stories of you know, mining by, you know, children in the Congo, etc. And so we've been very vigilant of making sure that our cobalt is sourced ethically. Although there's still issues that are associated with that, because, you know, that entire market is convoluted and uncertain. And so I think that it's only been very recently that safeguards have sort of come online to address these sorts of issues, because they actually are relatively new issues. And so I would say that in terms of both cobalt and lithium, going back to your question, in terms of the ethics that are involved in it, these are things that are only starting to be addressed right now, and that the world is just still so excited of this new technology that we can take advantage of for mobility applications, something that's greater than just a cell phone. And so I think that I'd say that I'm optimistic that that the safeguards will, you know, only get better in terms of increasing the ethics of its mining.
And I should say that that incisive and insightful question came from our audience. I made it seem like it was my own. But thank you very much. That's great to hear. So another question from our audience is with respect to Lake Winnipeg, the environmental impacts of Hydra, which was touched upon with respect to by two of our panelists. So Dr. Thompson, perhaps if you could answer this question, or to the best of your knowledge, do you know what is being done to support Indigenous communities affected by the impacts on Lake Winnipeg from hydro developments in the area?
Okay, so I should mention, if it hasn't been mentioned already, is renewable energy is considered by Canada as including large hydro, but the US and most other places do not consider large hydro as renewable energy, because it has a long-term impact. And we're seeing that in Lake Winnipeg, right? We're seeing the fluctuating water levels, and we've seen unnatural flooding, land, because of so much flooding. There's not wild rice. There's also areas, housing being flooded, and the water being so murky that fishermen, especially First Nation fishers on Lake Winnipeg, on the west side, are not able, or it's very difficult and expensive to fish because their nets are often ruined. What has been done is there was a task force or a review before the next, I guess, license. So there has been finally some compensation to a few communities, and but more has to be done. So there really has to be compensation for damages. I think of whole water, these communities never really are badly impacted, and yet had never received compensation until very recently, due to the license, seeking license renewal. So that process of looking at how to moderate the fluctuations so that they're not so extreme, that they're done considering fish populations, because that was never considered, is fish populations. And often the fluctuation expose the eggs on the side and so cause damages. So there's so much more to be considered, as well as the huge impact on not just fishermen, but all the communities. It really changed it. You know, according to my films, according to interviews, they say Hydra changes everything.
Thank you. We have another question from our audience. Robert wonders, and perhaps Dr. Oliver, you might have some insight onto this. Whatever happened to Ballard Industries? Presumably this is a fuel cell question.
I don't know. It's a very honest answer. I mean, I think part of the answer comes down to whether they were able to find the appropriate customers. I don't know, Mike, you may even have some insight there from the technology side. But
yeah, I'm happy to chime in there. So Ballard is alive and well. They are back from the dead. So when you look back to the hype machine of the 90s and the early 2000s, when Ballard was going to sort of be the cornerstone behind the eventual takeover by fuel cells of mobility, and they were going to be the ones who were going to make it electric, and it wasn't going to be battery back then because batteries weren't good enough. They've since pivoted to larger industrial more types of customers. So maybe more niche types of customers. So for example, if you want to compare hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells, for that matter, to batteries, batteries are they're more economical, they're more efficient, but their biggest downturns is that they have less energy density than hydrogen, and they can be refueled at a much it takes a longer time to refuel a battery powered vehicle than it does for hydrogen. Hydrogen can be done basically just like gasoline or any other fossil fuel. And so you have to look at the industries that really care about that. Things like trucking, things like electric plus heat combined systems. So they're around, but they're more looking at niche, less mainstream industries right now, and they're doing very well actually. They're just not going to be the future of your everyday commuter vehicle. That's the short answer of it.
And I think that illustrates one of the key points that came out in the comments that we've all made, whether we're talking about supplying energy for residential areas or for transportation. There's a complementarity to it. Where in any situation where you have a small isolated community, you can't just rely on one source of energy. You need something and wind and something and solar or whatever. Just as we have a complete mix of different energy sources supplying us here in Winnipeg, or in fact, if you look at the energy mix in any country across the world, there's a whole range of different sources because either natural events happen or whatever. The right fit for a large vehicle taking goods across the prairie or for a train is actually potentially quite a different power source than for a car that just has to commute halfway across town and back again. That's something that's easy to charge up overnight. But if you have a truck, you want to run that continuously for a number of days. If you have a train, you want to run that continuously for a long period of time. But then you also have a platform on which you can put a heavier, larger installation. So there's lots of different balances there.
Agreed.
So speaking of the different types of systems, so we've discussed, for example, different categories of renewable energy and those that don't necessarily fit in, such as hydro. Does anybody know anything about wind generated energy with respect to applications in the far north?
There are a couple of challenges in the far north, one of which is you can get ice buildup on the turbine blades, which instantly changes the aerodynamic profile and makes the whole process not only less efficient, but the blades get heavier. And so it's not easy to put a de-icing station on every turbine. So that's one of the challenges with putting turbines up north. There are other engineering challenges with just making continuously rotating machines operating in very cold conditions. But it's a very attractive source of energy to push it as far north as you can because it's fairly reliable.
And it's interesting, this has been touched upon by a number of people with respect to generating energy close to the population centers, the dense population centers that need the bulk of it. How do we transport that energy to and from those centers and those generating stations? With respect to just a diverse set of sources, though, we have a question from our audience about the progress that's been made with sodium-ion batteries. So we mentioned both lithium and cobalt. Would someone like to comment perhaps on sodium-ion batteries?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. So they're definitely a great alternative. I'm focused mostly on mobility applications, so I'm all about energy density. So as soon as you introduce or substitute sodium for lithium, you take a hit on your energy density. And so basically what happens is you change the application. So sodium ion batteries are just not suitable for mobility applications. And so we could look at them, I guess, more from a standpoint of a stationary type of application, such as within renewables to temper periods of off-peak for solar and wind. I'm not an expert really in that area, but I know that there's tons of work that's being going into it. We just don't hear about it because lithium ion and mobility applications are the sexy topic. And so it's really just a difference in public interest, if you will. But I do know for a fact a couple of groups who are working very closely on that problem, and it's for stationary applications because you can make cheaper batteries, you can make more of them, and then so you pay that energy density penalty, and so basically it's just a shift of applications. But the technology is alive and well.
It's one of those things where if the size of the installation will take a shipping container, then that's the sort of technology that will work. But you're not going to have a shipping container on the back of your car.
There you go. Exactly.
So it's really interesting to hear about the impetus for the development of various types of energy or energy storage systems with respect to their commercial applications, right? This is a question perhaps that Dr. Thompson, you might be able to weigh in on. But Murray was wondering what steps could potentially be taken to ensure a democratized energy future? How can we ensure that new and renewable technologies are accessible and controllable by all? I mean, you mentioned before the idea of more microgrids and distributed energy systems.
Well, Nova Scotia in Canada has taken a really interesting approach in the past where they had renewable energy targets, and a large percentage of that, which was taken right up, was community power. So this is asking communities to look at their situation and rather than have them pay for the feasibility studies, have the feasibility studies paid for. That's the limitations of community power, right? And so it's a requirement then to look at the feasibility and not put communities out, which did happen in Manitoba, where everyone bid for one one fairly large size wind turbine project. So having a renewable energy target, having a commitment to fund community energy creates a democracy and creates a local ownership of a number of projects resulted. You name it. There was biomass, there was lots of solar, lots of wind, but these communities wanted the wind, and they're the ones who bid for it. You often hear of the wind industry, right? Which is a very large wind, the multi-million, $50 million wind industry, and being in people's backyards that don't want it. But if people have an economic benefit and actually choose that power, it becomes a different story. It becomes a democratic process where people look at the resources available in their community and the possibilities for economic development. And there's 12 to 14, there's different studies for how much more energy stays in the community. One from the Europe shows 12 to 14 times if it's a local energy production, a community power project.
There are, I think, some communities in Germany where the mandate of what is essentially the equivalent of a city council or rural municipality is also to be the provider of, for example, electricity to that area. And that's sometimes how it can be broken up. One of the challenges that you have in more densely populated areas is the interdependence of the usage and the need to balance that off and actually keep a stable network. So if you have many, many, many contributors, the capacity for your network to maintain its stability suddenly it's very, very difficult. And that's where partly improvements in computer technology have helped power utilities smooth off those stability issues. And the other thing that can make networks unstable is where you have a long distance between where you generate power and where you use it. This is one of the technological reasons why we have DC power transmission from the dams up north to Winnipeg and indeed in other parts of both Canada and the rest of the world. Isolated communities such as you mentioned on the Atlantic coast can benefit from having the capacity to generate locally, but they also need to have some sort of backstop connection for the eventuality that their power goes down. Again, it comes back to being complementary in how you design that.
And part of that is a policy decision. So Ontario and many different provinces chose to have feed-in tariffs. So that's when it's not just producing for the local community, it's distributing to the larger grid and networks. And they have a guarantee of access to the grid. So that has existed in many, many provinces. And it's something that I'm sure will come to Manitoba soon. It's something that right now people are definitely can they can't make money from their household by generating power, whereas other places that is allowed. And so that then you can consider this as maybe your economic plan for the future, your pension plan where you're investing in renewable energy because you know you can sell it in the future.
But this actually adds a really important economic challenge. And Mike alluded to this when he was talking earlier. If one has one's house with solar panels and one can generate excess electricity from it and hope to sell it back, then you're critically dependent on how long those solar panels are actually going to last for that return on your investment. And one of the challenges with all of these technologies, and part of the lead time that we sort of touched on earlier, is proving that the technology will not just function, but will function for a long time. Because a solar panel that will last with the same level of efficiency for 5, 10, 15 years is much more interesting as a commercial proposition than something that's only going to last 18 months, if that. And that's part of the lead time required, as Mike talked about, the technology readiness levels. Can something be brought to market that will actually represent that value as a long-term investment?
And the idea of an economic boost that one can get from generating one's own power is a really interesting one. So we've mentioned, a couple of people have mentioned the idea of transmission lines, right? Connecting large hydro dams. And this is a direct analogy to pipelines. So we have a question, for example, from one of our audience members about how to balance the idea that Canada is a big exporter of energy, and how do we identify ways, or how do we balance the implementation of large-scale movement or delivery of energy, be it pipelines to the west, or in renewable context, be it hydroelectricity lines down to Minnesota, with the idea of respecting and not harming the communities through whose lands these large pieces of infrastructure might pass.
I think that's one of the biggest discussion points and challenges we face. You can contend that it's another part of the same discussion as deciding not just where would be good to mine for any mineral of interest, but how you're going to negotiate that land, not just the surface that's impacted, but the subsurface that the mine takes over, and who's going to take responsibility for the rehabilitation of that region after the mining has actually been completed. And these are long, decades and more than decades-long discussions that have been a part of the mining industry. And in fact, the framework of land ownership, as either determined by governments or negotiated, depending on where you are, this is something which everyone should have a party in, but is actually very difficult to ensure that it's done correctly for everyone at every stage of the way. And we have a lot of history of this maybe not working out so well for the people who live closest to these installations, that we have to somehow work out the best way to maybe rectify some of the things that have gone wrong in the past.
And Dr. Thompson, you had mentioned the idea of feed-in tariffs. A tariff that may be more close to most people's hearts is the idea of a carbon tax in general. So there's a question about how the plummeting price of oil and also the diversion of new investments to vaccine development might be affecting projects. So this is open to anybody on the panel, but the idea of accurately pricing pollution can give through carbon taxes, that could give a great boost to the uptake of renewable energy, but only if that's going to really tip the balance between two otherwise similarly cost-effective options, right? So if we think about electric buses, if you don't have an impetus to develop an electrification of your fleet, you're basically looking at the cost of it, right? And so a carbon tax can tip the balance, or a regulation can tip the balance. Does anybody have any comments on the outlook going forward? Perhaps Mike, you'd like to handle this one. How industry is looking 10, 20 years down the road with respect to forecasting the price of oil into the development of renewables?
Yeah, so it's definitely something that our customers are looking closely at, and typically what'll end up on my desk on a Monday morning is do a total cost of ownership analysis for this particular customer, who will want to know what's it going to cost to run a completely electric fleet versus a complete diesel fleet. So these are questions that will typically make their way towards me.
And I want to say some places have found it too high risk and are treating fossil fuels like cigarettes, right? They're not acceptable in pension plans, in certain pension plans. And I think that's a movement. These are high risk. They're endangering our planet, and they're not. They're becoming increasingly unacceptable, and we're seeing with the plummeting of oil that they're not cost effective anymore, right? So, as well as not political.
You're talking about the development of oil-based infrastructure, so companies investing in oil extraction. Is that what you mean by not with the lower the cost of oil? Because it remains cheap for people to use, but not profitable for companies to exploit.
Not profitable, right? So I'm sure people saw the headlines about it's actually costing money to take oil out of the ground now, right? So yes, a number of companies have divested from the tar sands, from oil, and I think also many pension plans and many, I think a number of universities have divested their pension plans from fossil fuels. It is a movement that is heading a certain direction, and many financiers are saying it's increasingly risky to invest in oil, to invest in fossil fuels, I should say.
The sense of inevitability that Dr. McDonald mentioned before. It's interesting in light of the second half of that question from our audience, which was, both how does the plummeting price of oil, but also the diversion of new investment to vaccine development, how is that affecting ongoing or other projects? So Dr. Thompson, you're sort of alluding to a second, the huge role that private investment has to play in it. How do you see sort of the ongoing investment of public funds or public interest, for example, in using money that is meant to redress issues with remote communities also at the same time addressing environmental issues around sustainable energy.
Right. And I think that's coming up right now as a political issue as we're trying to get a seat, right, on the United Nations Security. And they are asking as one of the requirements that they stop financing oil, subsidizing oil and gas. So definitely we've seen some huge subsidies when they bought the pipeline, for example. Our government has billions of subsidies going to oil. So that is something that the world, at least in the context of this United Nations seat, is they're asking that they have to commit to not stop subsidizing oil.
That's a great point. You think about globally how many governments also subsidize the purchase of fuel by their citizens as a politically palatable thing. With the decreasing cost of oil, there's an opportunity to get rid of these seemingly really entrenched subsidies. So we have another question from our audience in terms of Manitoba-specific criteria for thinking about renewable energy. So the question states that energy, power, and reserve capacity are three things that the U.S. Department of Energy looks for in renewables. Do we have any comments with respect to what Manitoba is specifically looking at with respect to developing renewable energy systems or storage systems?
I suspect the equivalents to those criteria are held in some form by the main provider of our electricity and natural gas, and the regulations that govern it. That would be my instinctive guess. One of the challenges with translating regulatory environments from places outside of Manitoba to Manitoba is the fact that Manitoba is, in terms of population and market, actually a very small place. And we have this sort of pseudo-monopolistic situation in many, many industries in Manitoba, basically because of our population size and essentially in terms of relative isolation. So it's rather hard, for example, to look at multiple competing entities producing power for parts of Winnipeg, although historically that was potentially the case. This is a scaling question, and it's interesting because it illustrates that the solution that might be good for a densely populated state on the east coast of the US is not necessarily the same solution as is good for Manitoba, just as the solutions for isolated communities in the north of Manitoba aren't necessarily the same solutions that are good for Winnipeg. And it's actually an illustration of that scaling challenge. So.
And it's also the renewable energies that are available. Geothermal isn't accessible everywhere, right? So it's looking at, where is the wind power the greatest? Where, what has good sun? So looking at the resources, it's all very local, and it's so exciting because we have so many good resources here in Manitoba. We have good wind power. We have great solar, right? We have so many days of solar. So lots of potentials, and we're part of the boreal. And so biomass is considered to be carbon neutral because as long as you plant back the trees that are harvested, right? Or, you don't change the land into non-forest area. So there's lots and lots of potentials for renewable energy and micro hydro in the future. Like we are seeing that large hydro is very expensive. There's delays, and we're moving towards another way of thinking and working, so we don't need these huge massive structures and huge power lines in order to realizing also that these power lines are getting older and are more susceptible to failure.
I'll add to Shirley's point there and say that you mentioned the advantages that we have in wind and solar, and I think that Hydra would probably see themselves as us obviously all having a huge advantage with hydropower as well, and they're going to be looking at it from an economic standpoint as well. One thing about Manitoba is, we don't really have much oil. We see, during good times, definitely not now, but during good times, we see our neighbors to the west who are able to harvest so many natural resources and reap the financial rewards of that. And we like to market ourselves as being, as our hydro being our oil. And so I think that what it really comes down to is that it's sort of this hierarchy of goodness or badness. And basically, Hydro is going to want to market themselves as being renewable and exporting as much of our power as possible, and saying that, not only are we being environmental, but we're also being economical because we're able to treat this as an export. So our quasi-renewable, or quasi-green, I should say, because it is renewable energy, is also being treated as a commodity here. So that's definitely going to be their viewpoint. It's a viewpoint that I share, at least to some extent, although I think that we can all agree that there's probably going to be no such thing as a fully green energy source. It's going to be a risk management exercise. Already here with batteries and solar, for example, there's huge issues with mining. There's hardly an area where we can look at energy production or energy storage or anything down the energy supply chain and not find a huge environmental issue. So basically, it's a pick your poison sort of situation. And I would I'd be a little cautious against criticizing hydro so much, because we actually have it really, really good here. Although it would be, like you say, I think it'd be a lie to say that, we've done a perfect job of it, and there's definitely areas of improvement.
Mm-hmm. And as the massive hydro that occurred in the past is, with the huge impacts of displacing communities, is not the hydro that they are undertaking today, right? And they're doing it in partnership with First Nation communities. And those partnerships have trade-offs. And definitely we've seen that around COVID-19 recently, where, there were barriers and there were risks, but that was negotiated well, and Manitoba Hydro backed down, right? So, they worked with communities and listened to communities and realized that they are imposing a risk, right? And so, it doesn't provide the local employment always, right? If we're flying 700 people in from the States and other provinces, it really does indicate that it's not providing the local employment. It's providing, employment for outsiders, right, that come into the north. And so, yes, I think there's difference. Definitely, those are in existence. And then we find that the provinces in Canada that are having the most gains are the coal ones, because they have to get out of coal. Whereas we're in hydro, so we're not seen as needing renewables as much. So the big coal, Ontario, Saskatchewan, well, not so much Saskatchewan, but Nova Scotia, lots of these are moving towards really exciting renewables, lots of small scale, lots of community power, whereas Manitoba has felt that they can ride on their hydropower from the past, and now they're working more effectively to make the impact smaller. They're still felt like they still fluctuate the waters, but at least it's not flooding whole communities like South Indian Lake or Opipisiwan Cree Nation and Shamasawan, where those two communities were displaced. That doesn't happen anymore, but it has, right? So we're kind of still living off that energy.
But it also illustrates part of the interlacing and the different timelines that you speak of. It also illustrates how long-term these investments actually are. The coal-fired resources that people are divesting themselves of, these are decades old. The infrastructure that transmits power in all parts of the world, some of it is actually over 100 years old and working reasonably well. Some of it is over 100 years old and absolutely needs renewal. But nonetheless, when companies put out for tender the contracts to put in these installations, part of the criterion for that is a decades-long life. And so there's that inertia in the system has to be recognized. So we can't say, oh, we're going to get out of hydro, because the investment we've made in the existing hydro facility still has decades to run, or as a community, we take a huge loss on the process. Equally, this is why some projects, once they get going, there comes a point of almost no return, where even if it's not been set up well, you have to try and make an effort to clean it up and make it a better project, simply because the scale of investment for the community supporting that is quite large. And that's why, going back to your illustration and talking about putting personal generation in a house or something as part of your pension plan, is a really important investment, because unless you can actually find infrastructure to support that won't require renewal on every 5-year basis, only then can you even hope to get a return on that investment that might be part of a pension.
And, you know, if you buy a new house after 2030, we're just setting it up for this net zero housing. It will have that option, right? At least you'll have energy sovereignty, or you'll be producing enough for your house, whether it's to the grid and it equalizes so you're not paying, or an alternative way. So by changing the building code, we're creating a different dynamic where everyone will be an energy producer. You know, a passive house is working without battery, you know, having the house as a battery, it doesn't necessarily need solar panels as much as a very, you know, as using it always needs some energy generation source, but it also creates efficiencies, right? So the easiest way, the cheapest way to make energy is not to use it.
That's a really great point. The question of aging infrastructure is one that, you know, is really worth thinking about, especially now when we're watching the government inject huge amounts of cash in efforts to shore up and stabilize an economy, and likely will want to stimulate economic growth at some point. So maybe I could ask each member of the panel to weigh in on this, but how do you foresee this, either in terms of an opportunity for wholesale change, or an opportunity to reimagine the infrastructure that could support renewables, or in terms of bridging technologies that might allow us to develop commercializable and realizable technologies on a multi-decade timescale? Anybody want to go first? I don't know.
Probably the transportation is the easiest one, isn't it? You know,
in terms of electrification of charging stations versus fuel and so on. Mike, do you have a comment on the worth of bridge technologies versus looking at wholesale change from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that the easy answer to that is that if you want to make mobility a part of the grid, no problem. We just need to do it. I would treat it more as an upgrade. And so, Derek raised the point that, we're working with some really old infrastructure in many different places, not just Manitoba, but probably everywhere around the world, where we became electric pretty much within the last century. And so if we're going to be asking our society to depend on electricity for mobility, in addition to our to our residential and to our industrial and to our commercial, then there should be a sizable investment that supports that as well, to make sure that we have that increase in robustness. So maybe you could look at that as a complementary opportunity. We probably need to upgrade it anyway, whether we go electric or not. So if we're going to go electric, we definitely need to do it. And so I think that we can use it as a great excuse to take advantage of some new technology and not be 100 years old.
So we probably have time for one final question from our audience. And so, Dr. Oliver, you had mentioned sort of the big savior elephant in the room being solar. So the question is, what is the current and future status of industries in solar energy harvesting globally, in terms of the possibility or the feasibility of them replacing on a whole scale or a large scale the use of oil or fossil fuels?
I think it's the almost, it's not the next thing that's happening or the thing that's happening, but it's the one after that, because the immediate race for what would be the renewable that would become really exciting, I think at the moment, is wind generation. If you look in Europe, the fraction of most nations in Western Europe that are generating power through wind has skyrocketed, and it's actually removed coal from the equation in most of Western Europe in the course of the last probably 15 years. So I think solar generation is probably going to wait its turn, in a sense that the economics of wind generation are going to have to go through sort of a full cycle. Just like we've seen, we could say that maybe hydroelectricity has gone through a further part of that cycle where it was thought of as extremely green and extremely environmentally friendly, but now has maybe people are starting to ask about those environmental questions a bit more. There's always been questions about large turbines installations and farms of them. No one wants big things in their backyard necessarily, but people are still debating on whether it's okay to put them just over their eyes and offshore. And certainly that's where a lot of them have ended up, both in the US and Europe and in fact in Asia. So I think part of it is the fact that wind has become mature in an economic sense. And part of it is also the technology, the efficiency of being able to actually extract the energy from solar. We know a lot of solar energy hits the planet. That's the easy part. But the cost of making the absorbers and the conversion of that into a form of energy that's useful is still not quite as competitive. And with that comes supply of the raw ingredients as well.
You know, you raised an interesting point that Dr. Thompson, you had also touched upon, Dr. Oliver, when you mentioned that wind has replaced coal in many countries. When we think about the gains in terms of emission reduction, so tangible improvements, we often think about the worst emitters and the improvements that they're making. We don't think about, you know, the incremental improvements that, you know, most other places are. Dr. Thompson, do you have something to add?
Yes, well, our worst polluters here in Manitoba and across Canada, like Iqaluit is diesel generating, Shamattawa, Lac Brochet. So, you know, these communities that are using diesel generation and is an easy no-brainer to have renewable energies there. That would be very, very cost effective, create much more energy security. That those communities are really at risk, and provide local economies as well, right? So I think that's win-win. Hydra, they're looking at making that entirely renewable energy, which makes a lot of sense. It was a diesel generator and a beautiful, you know, so it's looking at those first, but also I do think energy security is so important, and that we do have to look at, with growing climate change and growing risks from all sorts of things of power going down, we do have to create emergency shelters that have renewables, right? Is someplace to go, because the lights are going to go off, the heat is going to go off, right? So, you know, but those could be used as also displays. Like, we have to become more comfortable with renewable energies and realize that these are a wonderful solid backup that you know, can provide energy in when things go down. And using batteries from our cars, like, there are all sorts of ways that we can use existing infrastructure, multiple ways to provide more energy security. So electric batteries, I should say.
Well, thank you. And that about takes us to the close of the time that we have for today. So thank you again to our panel and to our audience. I just wanted, in concluding, to say that throughout human history, economic activity and energy demands have been strongly linked. And while this direct relationship may have weakened of late, it will likely survive for the foreseeable future. With the consequences of human-caused climate change becoming increasingly clear and ever more immediate, Navigating our way to a future in which environmental impacts can be decoupled from energy use is arguably one of the critical challenges of our time. So we hope that this evening's discussion has given you a sense of how publicly funded researchers in academia and those in the private sector industry in Manitoba are trying to tackle this issue. So thanks to you all for tuning in, for your questions. Thank you very much to our panel for their insight and expertise. And special thanks to Dr. Digvir Jayas and the Office of the Vice President, Research and International at the University of Manitoba for running this excellent series, and in particular to Janine Harasimchuk and Luc Desjardins for all their work behind the scenes. Please be sure to continue to tune into future online cafes. We look forward to welcoming you back in person at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future. Have a great night.
Good night.